Okay, let's go ahead and get started. So remember when we started talking about the syllabus, I opened up with talking about the literal, grammatical, and historical approach with this contextual overlay, if you will. And so we're going to talk just a little bit about that right now with respect to hermeneutics. And so first, the literal approach. And with that, we focus on taking the plain meaning of the text unless it makes no sense. And you're going to hear me say that quite a bit throughout the semester. When we get to interpretation, you'll hear me say it again because I do want you to simply take the plain meaning of the text unless it makes no sense. And again, I already told you when it's not going to make sense. It'll make no sense if it's figurative or symbolic language, all right? But other than that, you are free to take the plain sense of the text, okay? So just keep that in mind. So when I talk about the plain sense of the text or the literal meaning, it's the common sense or the normal meaning of the actual words used. The phrases that are used, the sentences that are used, just take them at face value. If it says this is blue, then just take it as it being blue and don't think that blue means something else, that blue really means red. No, it's blue. So take the plain sense of the text unless it makes no sense. And so again, what is the normal common sense understanding of the author's words? Not to allegorize something, and that's looking for some symbolic expression, or not to spiritualize something, looking for some hidden sacred meaning embedded in a word or phrase, all right? But just take the normal usage of the text. And so you take the plain sense of the text, the natural flow of a passage. That word pericope is just passage of Scripture or a slice of Scripture. Normal meaning by the author, and then, of course, expanded to other authors. And we'll show you how to do a word study where you focus on first what the author says in this particular passage, then what he says in passages around that passage, and then you move from that chapter to the rest of the book that author wrote. Then you move to other passages of Scripture in other books that he wrote. Then you move to all of either the New Testament or the Old Testament. Then you move to all of the Bible dealing with that particular word. And so that you kind of expand, if you will, your research as you look at a particular word doing a word study, all right? But you're looking for the normal usage of the word, the plain sense of the word, customary usage, straightforward language. I'm trying to make it as simple and as straightforward as possible. The literal words used in the text. That's what when I'm talking about, and you'll see it in some of the writings. It'll have LGH. And it stands for literal, grammatical, historical, okay? And so this is the L in LGH. So note that the literal approach does not preclude figurative or symbolic language. It's just that you only look to figurative or symbolic language when the literal expression does what? When do you look for figurative or symbolic language? Yeah, when the literal doesn't make sense, exactly. If it makes sense, run with it. If it doesn't make sense, that's a tip-off that is figurative or symbolic. Jesus had a double-edged sword hanging out of his mouth. I mean, come on, that doesn't make much sense if you take it literally, right? And so again, you're looking for this secondary meaning. So the literal approach is based on the literal fulfillment of Scripture, and I'm just giving you a few examples, but we have literal fulfillment of Scripture in quite a few passages of the Bible, but these are just a few to take a look at, all right? And so we could take the literal approach because Scripture has been literally fulfilled, all right? Isaiah talked about Jesus dying, the suffering servant. Jesus literally died, all right? It was literally fulfilled what Isaiah predicted. So we can take the literal approach to the text, okay? But also keep in mind, that the literal does not preclude us from looking at figurative and symbolic when it doesn't make sense, all right? The literal, that is. The next area is the grammatical approach. And this is, this is kind of like, and I hate to put it this way, but sometimes I have to put it this way, is that sometimes you have to take medicine if you want to get better, all right? And some people take grammar as the castor oil of taking medicine. You guys are probably too young to remember castor oil, but when I was growing up, castor oil was the panacea for all ills. Every year before we would go to school, when the summer was ending, but she would line us all up and she would say, okay, there's two things you got to take before you start back to school. One was cod liver oil, and you could take that straight, no problem, tough, But castor oil, you had two choices. You could take it straight. Actually, you had three choices. You had to take it straight, you could take it with tomato juice, or you could take it and then suck on an orange real quick, a slice of orange, all right? But when you got through, you were at the men's and ladies' room so often there was nothing inside to get sick, because everything inside was gone, So sometimes grammar can be the castor oil. You got to take it because it's going to make you healthy, but sometimes it's tough to take, especially if you've been away from it for a while. And most of my students have been away from English grammar for a while. I mean, the formal aspect. You've been writing maybe, but the formal aspect. And so we're going to, literally, I learned more English grammar by studying Greek than all of the English grammar I learned when I was going through grade school. And so here, you're going to learn some of the rules of the road to help you interpret passages of Scripture, okay? And so at the beginning, we talked about the Old Testament written in what? What was the Old Testament written in? Hebrew and Aramaic. Now in this class, I never give you a trick question. If I ask you a question, it's probably already on the screen. All you got to do is look around. Or it's probably already in your notes. There are no trick questions, all right? So Old Testament was written in what? Hebrew and Aramaic. New Testament written in what? Greek and Aramaic, exactly, all right? And so each one of those languages has rules of grammar that we have to abide by when we're looking at these passages. Greek in particular is very precise in using words to describe things. And so sometimes grammar really facilitates you interpreting a passage of Scripture. And so let's take a look at a passage of Scripture, Proverbs 14:1. Proverbs 14:1. Let's turn to that. Proverbs 14:1. First one there is the first one to read.
It says, the wise woman builds her house, but the foolish pulls it down with her hands.
Yeah, the wise woman builds her house, but the foolish woman pulls it down with her hands. So let's take a look at this from a grammatical standpoint, all right? So it says the wise woman builds, the word is banah, that's the Hebrew word for builds, banah. It's in the perfect tense. And the perfect tense denotes an action that is completed, all right? It's completed. So keep that in mind. It's in the tense that is completed. So a wise woman completes her actions. And so read that passage of scripture again.
It says, the wise woman builds her house, but the foolish pulls it down.
Okay, but now there's a 3-letter word after it describes that the wise woman is building or has built this house. What's the 3-letter word? But, all right? And but denotes what? I told you, nothing, no trick questions on the board. But denotes a what? No trick questions in this class. What's the word on the board? In the last line, what's the key word? Contrast. But denotes a contrast. You got to remember that. You're going to learn a lot of scripture if you remember that 3-letter word, but, denotes a contrast. So here's a tip-off. Anytime you see the word but, you ought to immediately tell yourself that everything that comes after the but is going to be the opposite of what came before the but. Because you already know that the but denotes a what? Contrast. Exactly. So just looking at the grammar, this is what I'm saying, how grammar can be very important. Just looking at the grammar, you know that the word but is a contrast, so that before you read the rest of the passage, you already know that everything that follows after that but is going to be different, or is going to be opposite of what you just read before the but. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. So if the wise woman is building the house, then the foolish woman is doing what? Tearing it down. Just the opposite of building. You need an ink pen? Mm-hmm. Just the opposite, right? That's what you got to remember. Okay, and we haven't even gotten into the passage yet, but just the little 3-letter word but, knowing grammar, helps you to automatically say, whatever's coming after this is going to be different than what came before. So watch this. So in contrast, so we said that bana, the word build, was in what tense? Perfect tense. And perfect tense meant what? Completed action, right? So now let's go to the second part of that. The foolish tears down with her own hands. Look at the word for tears down. Harass is the word. What does that sound like? Harass. What's the English word? Say it. Harass. Yeah, harass. Exactly. So she tears it down. So look at this. That word is in the imperfect tense. Okay? The imperfect tense. Now, if the perfect tense was completed action, then the imperfect tense must mean what? Incomplete. That's right. That is incomplete action. So you can see the first part had a completed action. The second part had an incomplete action. So what the text is telling you is that the wise woman builds her house and completes that action. The foolish woman continues to tear the house down. Even when the kids are grown and gone, she's still talking about them, telling them that there never will be anything. So her activity continues on because it's never completed. And so you can tell the difference between the wise woman and the foolish woman by knowing that 3-letter word, which is what? But. That's right. And so it's very important that you get more involved in grammar so that it will help you to interpret and understand these passages. And with just knowing but, the first thing you would have known is that what came on the left, in front of the but on the left side, was going to be different from what came on the right side. So from now on, when you're reading scripture, that should be the first thing that comes to your mind when you see a but in the passage. You need to stop and say, whoa, wait a minute. What came before this but is going to be different than what came after the but, because but denotes a what? A contrast. Remember that. Don't forget that word. But denotes a contrast. Okay? And we did all of that by way of grammar. So grammar becomes very important. Now, next, the historical approach. It focuses on the fact that the events of Scripture occurred at a point in time. Remember, you hear me say all the time that when you approach the Bible with two worlds, the ancient world and the modern world. The ancient world and the modern world. Okay, so keep that in mind, two worlds. This is the historical setting for which the biblical times unfolded. Of course, time, the Greek word is chronos, and you have synchronic, which is a snapshot in time, and then diachronic, which is throughout time. And so, again, there's this historical setting, ancient world that you're dealing with. You're not in a modern world when you're reading the Bible, you're in the ancient world. And so you got to keep that in mind. And so let's not forget the importance of context. So, Mika, you want to move this? I'm sorry. So when we talk about context, because this is real important to looking at Scripture, let's just say that this right here is what we call TP. TP is the target passage. Okay, so context would be that information that came before the target passage and that information which came after the target passage. So students will ask me all the time, well, how far back should I go in order to get the context? Well, that depends on how far you need to go back. You keep going back until you get everything that you need to understand the context of this target passage, or you go forward after the target passage as far as you need to go. There's no only go back 2 scriptures or only go back 3 scriptures. You go back as far as you need to go. But this is what we call the overall context of that particular passage. All right? So keep that in mind. Context is king, because you will learn more scripture as you continue to study the Bible by way of context than any other method that I will teach you. And for that matter, any other method that you learn as you continue to study Scripture. Context is that important, because you have to know the environment in which the words. I could say, here's a good example of knowing the context. I could say, Rice and I, we went hunting, and we were out on the prairie, and we saw a guy with a bad gun. I mean, that gun was bad, real bad. I mean, it had all of the flashy engravings on it and all of the nice, very nice scope. That gun was really bad, all right? So in that context, what does bad mean? Nice. Yeah, nice or good, exactly. But then I said, well, you know, the other day, Rice turned in an essay, and man, it was pretty bad. It was pretty bad. Now, what kind of bad is that? Yeah, so in that case, bad meant bad, but in the other case, bad meant good. The only way you could detect which one meant which is the context in which I set it up, right? And the words around that one word bad. And so again, that's what you got to understand when you're reading the Bible, is that it's set in a context, and you just can't zero in on one word and think, you know, without the context that you're going to be able to understand it.
So in that case, you would say the author writes and controls the context, right?
Absolutely. Absolutely. And remember, you have how many authors that we're dealing with? 2. Right, exactly. And so you're exactly right. So you don't want to take, that's why it's important not to take scripture out of context. That's right. That's right. That's why you don't want to ever do that. because it's God controlling the context and the intended meaning. And when you take it out of context, you distort his word. So that's a very good point that you just raised. All right. So the biblical information that comes before and after the target passage, that's the context. Context is king. So let me ask you something. What's the smallest context in the Bible? In the text. Smallest would be a verse. All right. What's the next largest context? That would be a paragraph. All right. And a paragraph is, a group of verses or sentences containing one primary thought. Then next would be, the next largest context would be a segment. And a segment is defined as paragraphs strung, two or more paragraphs strung together that really that are related in some way. All right. So that would be the segment. The next largest context, what do you think the next largest context from a segment would be? A yes, sir. A chapter. Very good. A chapter. And the next largest context would be what? Correct. That would be a book. All right. And then the next largest context would be what?
Testament.
That's right. What'd you say?
A testament.
Yeah, a testament. Old and new. All right. We got two. All right. So a testament.
Testament. Well, I just meant
Yeah.
testament like next one.
Right. Now, I understand what you're saying. So we got two. Old Testament, New Testament. And then what would be the next largest context?
Bible.
The entire Bible. Thank you very much. That's right. The entire Bible. So that's the biblical context. All right. So that one verse is connected to the rest of the Bible. That's what I was drawing up there earlier today, the biblical meta-narrative, God's sovereign right to rule on earth as he does in heaven, his right to love and to be loved. That one little bitty verse is connected to the rest of the Bible. Okay? And so that's why, again, you just don't read scripture disconnected from the rest of the Bible. All right? Any questions so far? Okay, good. Here's some other context. You got the historical context, you got the geographical context, the theological context, and the sociological and anthropological context. These are other types of contexts. All right, and we'll be dealing with these, especially when we get into interpretation. We'll deal with them a lot more than what we're talking about tonight. Tonight is just to kind of get your feet wet, to introduce these concepts, to get you thinking about these concepts. Okay? So remember, when you study the Bible, you're dealing with how many worlds? Two worlds. What are they? And modern world, right? That's right. And you're going to do your interpretation in the ancient world. That's what you got to go to. All right? So you got to step into the ancient world where you're going to do your exegesis. You'll do your application in the modern world, but you'll do your exegesis in the ancient world. So, of course, the Bible is theocentric. That means that it's God-centered. The Bible is centered around God the Father's right to rule on earth as he does in heaven, his right to love and to be loved. All right? So Jesus is in the center of all of what the Father did, is doing, and will do. And, of course, here are just some scriptures to take in to deal with that perspective. And that's a ton of them. Again, you'll get this chart, or you'll get these charts in an upload to Canvas. All right? All of Scripture in the final analysis is from God and to and through humanity. But God is the source of all information and meaning. And so we need to keep that in mind as we read Scripture. and all meaning must be consistent with God's revelation. You know, passages don't contradict one another, but they complement and harmonize with one another. So again, remember, we talked about using the literal, grammatical, and historical approach with an overlay of the context, and that's how we got where we are. All right?